Hello, friend. Welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now, let's get into the story. The rain had been relentless that evening, hammering against the thin, rusted roofs of the student hostel, filling the narrow corridors with the scent of damp earth and soaked clothes. Amika sat hunched over his notebook, his fingers smudged with ink as he scribbled down notes under the dim light of a flickering bulb. His stomach growled in protest, but he ignored it. There were more pressing matters. Exams were only a few days away, and the last thing he could afford was failure. That was when the door creaked open, and Prince stepped inside, his clothes drenched, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had settled on them. His eyes, usually filled with mischief, were dull, exhausted. Emika had seen that look before, hopelessness, the kind that swallowed people whole. Without a word, Prince dropped his soap bag to the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the notebook on Emika's lap, as if it held the answers to all his problems. It wasn't the first time Prince had come to him like this, desperate and overwhelmed. University had been a battlefield for them both, but while Emika had fought his way through with discipline, Prince had always relied on his charm, his ability to talk his way out of things. It worked until it didn't. Now, he was drowning in unread textbooks, past questions he didn't understand, and a creeping fear of failure that clung to him like a shadow. Emika could have turned him away. He could have told him it was too late, that he should have studied when he had the chance. But that wasn't who Emika was. With a sigh, he slid the notebook across the table and motioned for Prince to sit beside him. "We'll go over it together," he said, his voice steady, determined. "But you have to focus." What followed were hours of whispered explanations, scribbled formulas, and the occasional frustrated groan from Prince. He wasn't the best student, but he tried, and that was enough for Emika to keep going. As the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, something shifted between them, a silent understanding, an unspoken promise. In that dimly lit room, a bond was formed, one that felt unbreakable. Days turned into weeks, and their friendship solidified like cement. They became inseparable, two sides of the same coin. Where Emika was cautious, Prince was reckless. Where Emika planned, Prince improvised. But somehow it worked. They balanced each other in ways neither fully understood. Late-night study sessions turned into morning jogs. Exam tensions dissolved into laughter over cheap roadside meals. Emika had always been the type to walk alone, to rely on no one but himself, but with Prince, things felt different. For the first time, he had someone to share the weight of university life with, someone who, despite his flaws, felt like a brother. And maybe in another world, things would have remained that way. Maybe their story would have been one of unwavering loyalty, of two friends conquering the world together. But fate had other plans, and the cracks, though invisible then, had already begun to form beneath the surface. The city stretched before them like an endless maze of ambition and struggle, its streets pulsing with the hurried footsteps of dreamers and survivors alike. It had been months since they graduated, and the weight of adulthood had settled on their shoulders like an unspoken burden. Emika had been the first to secure a job, a modest position in a growing company, nothing glamorous, but stable enough to keep his mind at ease. Prince followed shortly after, securing a role in the same company through Emika's recommendation. On their first day, as they stood before the towering office building, Prince had laughed and clapped a hand on Emika's shoulder. "We made it, brother," he had said, his grin infectious, and in that moment Emika had believed him. The world felt vast and full of promise, their paths intertwined just as they had been in university. But life outside the walls of academia was not as forgiving. Deadlines loomed like storm clouds, expectations suffocated, and the simplicity of their former struggles now felt like a distant memory. At first, they moved in unison, as they always had, learning, adapting, navigating the complexities of their new roles with cautious optimism. Emeka found comfort in routine, pouring himself into his work, striving for excellence and quiet determination. Prince, however, grew restless. The same charm that had once gotten him through exams now manifested in different ways. Late arrivals softened by smooth excuses, missed tasks covered up with effortless confidence. He was good at talking and making people believe what he wanted them to, and for a while, it worked. Then the changes began. It was subtle at first, an expensive new wristwatch here, a pair of designer shoes there. Emeka noticed but didn't question, assuming Prince had been saving. But soon, the changes became too obvious to ignore. Dinners at restaurants far beyond their means, drinks at upscale lounges where the wealthy played, and a new air about him, as though he had unlocked some secret the rest of them were too blind to see. When Emeka finally asked, Prince had laughed, waving off the concern. "Some of us are just luckier than others," he had said, his voice light, his eyes unreadable. But luck had never been something Prince relied on before. Emeka knew him too well to believe in coincidences, but no matter how much he pressed, the answers never came. The distance between them grew in ways Emeka couldn't quite define. It wasn't a fight or an argument, just a slow unraveling, a shift in their dynamic that left Emeka feeling like a spectator in his best friend's life. They still spoke, still shared meals, but there were gaps now. Empty spaces where trust had once been, and though Emeka couldn't explain why, an uneasiness settled in his chest, a quiet warning that something was changing, that something was slipping beyond his control. The first time Emeka heard the name James, it was in passing, a casual mention during one of their conversations at lunch. Prince had spoken about him like he was an older brother, someone who knew the ins and outs of the company better than anyone else. At first, Emeka hadn't thought much of it. Prince had always been the type to make friends easily. But as weeks passed, it became clear that James wasn't just another colleague. His presence loomed over their friendship like an unseen shadow, stretching further with each passing day. Prince, who had once spent his free time brainstorming ideas for career growth with Emeka, was now slipping away, caught in hushed conversations with James in the far corners of the office. There was an air of secrecy around them, a kind of understanding that didn't need words. Emeka would occasionally walk into the break room to find them speaking in low voices, their discussions cutting off the moment they saw him. It wasn't just the secrecy that unsettled him, it was the look in James' eyes, a knowing smirk that seemed to hold something more than casual workplace camaraderie. Over time, Prince's lifestyle changed even further, but this time, it wasn't just about wealth, it was about influence. He spoke with a new confidence, carried himself like someone who had uncovered a shortcut to success that the rest of them were too naive to understand. His expenses had grown bolder, his habits more reckless. Emeka noticed how their once easy friendship had become strained, conversations feeling more like interrogations. Whenever Emeka pressed for answers, Prince would dismiss his concerns with an easy grin, his words laced with amusement. "You worry too much, Emeka?" he'd say, reaching for his latest luxury purchase, as though material things could justify the growing distance between them. It wasn't just the money, though. Prince had changed in ways that went beyond what Emeka could explain. He had become secretive, defensive, and at times almost unrecognizable. The man who had once relied on Emeka for everything now acted like he existed in a different world entirely, one Emeka had no access to. Then came the moment that turned Emeka's unease into certainty. One evening, as most employees were packing up for the day, he overheard something he was never meant to. He had returned to his desk to retrieve a forgotten file when he heard voices coming from a nearby storage room. It was Prince and James, their conversation muffled but urgent. Emeka hesitated, his fingers tightening around the file as he listened. "We just have to be careful," James was saying. "If we play this right, no one will even know." There was a pause, then Prince's voice, quieter but tinged with excitement. "I know. We've come this far already." The words settled in Emeka's chest like a weight, something shifting inside him as realization dawned. He didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but one thing was certain. Prince was involved in something bigger than he had let on, something dangerous, and for the first time since their friendship had begun, Emeka felt truly alone. The air in the office had changed, thick with an unspoken tension that only Emeka seemed to notice. It was in the way people whispered just out of earshot, the way James and Prince exchanged knowing glances before slipping out of the building together. Emeka found himself watching more closely, piecing together moments that had once felt insignificant. He began noticing how Prince's workload had mysteriously lightened, his reports handed in without much effort, while others in the department struggled under the weight of new responsibilities. There was a pattern to it all. Prince always seemed to be one step ahead, always had the right excuse at the perfect time. Emeka's stomach twisted as the truth took shape in his mind. The person he had once trusted without question had become someone he could no longer read. And the worst part? Prince knew it. He saw the way Emeka watched him now, the silent doubt behind his eyes, and he did nothing to correct it. Instead, he played along, smirking whenever Emeka's gaze lingered too long, as if daring him to ask the question that burned inside him. One evening, as the office emptied and the hum of computer monitors faded into silence, Emeka found himself following Prince without thinking. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but something in his gut told him this was a night he needed to see for himself. He kept his distance as Prince and James slipped through a side door leading to a restricted storage area, the flickering hallway lights casting long shadows against the concrete walls. Emeka's breath caught as he peered around the corner, his pulse hammering as he watched them pry open a cabinet filled with company inventory, expensive tools, high-grade materials, things that could easily go unnoticed if taken in small amounts. James moved with practiced ease, stuffing a few items into his bag while Prince stood guard, his foot tapping anxiously against the floor. The sight made Emeka's stomach churn. He had known, deep down, that something was wrong, but seeing it unfold before him was something else entirely. His mind raced with what this meant, not just for Prince, but for himself. If anyone found out he was even remotely connected to this, suspicion would fall on him too. He needed to leave before they noticed him. But just as he turned to slip away, his foot caught against the loose tile of the hallway floor, sending a sharp sound echoing through the silence. Instantly, Prince and James stiffened, their heads snapping toward the noise. Emeka pressed himself against the cold wall, his breath shallow as he waited. He could hear them whispering, their voices tense. "Did you hear that?" James muttered. Prince hesitated before shaking his head. "Probably nothing. Let's just finish this and get out." Emeka didn't dare move until they were gone, until the distant sound of the exit door clicking shut told him he was alone. He exhaled shakily, his hands clammy against his sides. This was no longer about suspicion. He had proof now, proof that could ruin everything. But as he stood there, staring at the ransacked storage cabinet, a terrifying thought crept into his mind. If he knew the truth, then that meant something else, something far worse. Prince and James would do anything to make sure no one else ever did. Sleep became an impossible task for Emeka after what he had witnessed. Every time he closed his eyes, the memory of Prince and James looting the storage room replayed in his mind, a stark confirmation that the friend he had once trusted was now someone entirely different. At work, he moved with caution, his once casual demeanor replaced by a rigid awareness of his surroundings. He was certain Prince had noticed. There was something in the way he looked at Emeka now, as if searching for cracks in his silence, trying to gauge whether he had spoken to anyone. Emeka hadn't, but the burden of secrecy pressed heavily against his chest. The weight of it made every interaction with Prince feel forced, unnatural. The easy conversations they once had were gone, replaced by a tense politeness that fooled no one. James, on the other hand, had grown bolder, more confident, his smirk lingering just a second too long whenever their paths crossed. It was as if he knew Emeka wouldn't dare say a word, that he had already been trapped in a web he hadn't even realized he had stepped into. Then came the meeting that changed everything. A sudden, unexpected announcement from management. There had been ongoing investigations into missing company inventory, and new security measures were being implemented. Whispers spread across the office like wildfire, speculation and worry filling every corner. Emeka watched as Prince and James exchanged uneasy glances, their usual arrogance momentarily faltering. Hidden CCTV cameras had been installed in various locations, though no one knew exactly where. The company was no longer relying on suspicion alone. They were searching for undeniable proof. Emeka could see the gears turning in Prince's mind, the calculations behind his eyes, as he tried to find a way out of this tightening noose. And then, without warning, Prince did the one thing Emeka hadn't expected. He turned the suspicion toward him. During the staff questioning session, when management asked if anyone had noticed anything unusual, Prince spoke up, his tone carefully measured. "I don't know much," he said, casting a hesitant glance in Emeka's direction. "But Emeka spends a lot of time in the storage area. Maybe he's just doing extra work, but I don't know." The insinuation was subtle, but devastating. Emeka felt the shift immediately. Eyes turned toward him, not with open accusation, but with quiet curiosity, the kind that planted seeds of doubt, that made people start second-guessing things they had never thought about before. The betrayal stung in a way he hadn't expected, not just because Prince had chosen to frame him, but because of how effortlessly he had done it. As if their years of friendship meant nothing, as if Emeka was just another pawn to be sacrificed. Panic clawed at his throat, but he forced himself to stay composed. He couldn't afford to react, not yet. If he lashed out now, if he gave them any reason to believe the lie, it would be over for him. Instead, he met Prince's gaze across the room, searching for something, regret, hesitation, a flicker of guilt. But there was nothing, only cold calculation. And in that moment, Emeka understood something terrifying. Prince had already decided how this would end, and if Emeka wasn't careful, he would be the one left with nothing. Emeka had never experienced true helplessness until the moment he realized he had been marked as the scapegoat. The weight of suspicion settled on his shoulders like a slow, suffocating grip, tightening with every sideways glance, every whispered conversation that abruptly ended when he walked into a room. He could feel it, the slow erosion of trust, the silent judgment that lingered in the air. Even those who once spoke to him freely now seemed distant, their words careful, as though being associated with him carried its own risk. He wanted to fight back, to deny the accusations outright, but he knew that desperation would only make things worse. The brilliance of Prince's betrayal lay in its subtlety. He hadn't directly accused Emeka, only planted the idea, letting doubt take root in the minds of their colleagues. It was a slow poisoning, one that Emeka had no immediate cure for. And Prince? He moved through the office untouched, his usual charm intact, his hands clean. There was no sign of regret in his expression, no crack in his carefully maintained facade. It was as if Emeka had never meant anything to him at all. When the official interrogation came, it was swift and ruthless. The management team wasted no time in laying out their findings, the missing items, the increasing pattern of theft, the need for someone to be held accountable. They asked questions, but they were not looking for answers. They had already decided who the guilty party was. Emeka was forced to sit through the questioning, his every response met with skepticism, his every explanation dismissed as an excuse. And then came the final blow, security footage. They had captured movements near the storage areas, moments that, when taken out of context, painted him as the prime suspect. Of course, the footage that would have shown Prince and James in the act was nowhere to be found. Emeka felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what had happened. They had planned for this. James had been at the company long enough to understand its security blind spots, and Prince had played his role perfectly, keeping his own involvement hidden while ensuring Emeka stood directly in the line of fire. It was a flawless betrayal, one executed with precision, leaving Emeka powerless against the accusations. And when the verdict was reached that he was to be held responsible, fined, and immediately dismissed, there was nothing he could do but sit in the deafening silence of his own downfall. The final humiliation came when he tried to reach out to Prince, clinging to some desperate hope that their friendship had not been entirely destroyed. He called once, twice, a dozen times. Each attempt met with nothing but a ringing void on the other end. When he finally saw Prince in person, it was outside the office, by the parking lot, where the evening sun cast long shadows across the pavement. "You know I didn't do this," Emeka said, his voice raw, searching for something, anything, in Prince's eyes. But all he got was a casual shrug, a smirk that barely touched his lips. "Life's unfair, Emeka," Prince said, his tone almost amused, as if the betrayal was nothing more than an unfortunate inconvenience. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emeka standing in the cold embrace of his own destruction, his life shattered by the very person he had once called a friend. The days after Emeka's dismissal blurred into one another, each passing hour dragging beneath the weight of betrayal. He had spent years building his life, only to watch it collapse in an instant, and the injustice of it gnawed at him relentlessly. The fine imposed on him was crushing, an amount so outrageous it ensured he would be drowning in debt for years to come. Every attempt to clear his name was met with indifference. His former colleagues had already moved on, their whispers fading into the background as if he had never existed. Even those who once called him a friend kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with the supposed thief. But it wasn't just the humiliation or financial ruin that haunted him, it was the silence. Prince had cut him off completely, severing every tie with the ease of someone discarding an old, useless object. The realization left a hollow ache in his chest, an emptiness that festered into something darker. He told himself he didn't care, that he would rebuild, that this wouldn't break him. But at night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the truth clawed its way to the surface. He wanted justice, and if justice wouldn't come for him, he would find it himself. His chance arrived unexpectedly. It started with a rumor, a whisper in a late-night phone call from an old contact at the company. Security had intensified. More items had gone missing after his departure, and management was growing restless. But the real revelation came when the caller mentioned CCTV footage. New, undeniable evidence had surfaced. Emeka sat frozen as the words sunk in, his mind racing through possibilities. Had they finally caught Prince and James? His contact refused to say more, but the implication was clear. Something was happening, something that could shift everything. Emeka's pulse pounded as he hung up, his thoughts spiraling in a dangerous direction. He had spent weeks suffocating under the weight of false accusations while the real culprits thrived. Now the balance had shifted, and he wasn't going to sit idly by. That night, he found himself outside the company's gates, watching the building from the shadows. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he was looking for, only an unshakable need to see things unravel with his own eyes. And then, as if fate itself had been waiting for him, he saw them, Prince and James, slipping out through the back entrance, their bags weighed down with stolen goods. The sight sent a bolt of cold fury through him. They had never stopped. Even after sacrificing him, after watching him struggle, they had continued without hesitation, their greed insatiable. And worse, they had laughed at him for it. The thought made his hands curl into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had spent weeks drowning in his own downfall while they celebrated in the shadows. But not anymore. Not this time. He turned away, his mind sharpening into focus. He didn't need revenge. He needed the truth. And this time, he wouldn't be the one caught in their trap. He would wait, he would watch, and when the moment was right, he would make sure that when they fell, there would be no one left to save them. The atmosphere in the company shifted in ways only the guilty could sense. A weight of unease settled over the building, creeping into every hallway and lingering in every conversation. Prince, usually smooth and self-assured, had grown wary. his eyes darting to security cameras more often than before. James, though less outwardly anxious, had begun arriving earlier and leaving later, as if prolonging his presence would somehow grant him insight into what the management knew. Emeka, though no longer part of the company, remained a silent observer from the outside. He had learned patience in his suffering, had sharpened his instincts in the wake of betrayal, and now he waited, listening for the moment when the noose would tighten around the necks of those who had wronged him. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted, was that they were no longer in control of their narrative. The hidden cameras they had once outmaneuvered had finally seen them for what they were, and the company was no longer relying on accusations and suspicions. This time, they had proof. It started as whispers among the management team, subtle shifts in their approach, a sudden interest in monitoring the storage areas without alerting the staff. A select few in security had been granted access to a recording that showed everything: the stolen inventory, the smug laughter of two men who had once framed an innocent colleague. But management wasn't satisfied with past evidence. They wanted more. A trap was set, a test of greed disguised as an opportunity. A high-value tool was deliberately placed in the storage room, its presence announced in passing conversation, a detail mentioned just loud enough for the right ears to hear. Emeka, from a distance, felt the storm building. He had anticipated this moment, had felt it brewing in the air ever since he overheard rumors of increased security measures. He knew Prince and James too well, knew that their hunger for easy money would blind them to the warning signs. And so, he watched from the outside as the game unfolded, knowing that this time they would not slip away unscathed. Prince hesitated at first, but James, ever the manipulator, pushed forward, his confidence unwavering. The lure of one last heist, one final score before things became too risky, was too much to resist, and so, under the cover of night, they made their move, slipping into the storage room with the same arrogance that had once protected them. But as they reached for the tool, the doors sealed shut behind them. The sharp click of a lock engaging sent a jolt of panic through them, followed by the unmistakable glow of a security camera, its lens fixed directly on them. The realization hit instantly: this was no accident, no malfunction. They had walked straight into the hands of those who had been waiting. And just outside, unseen but knowing, Emeka let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Justice, slow and deliberate, had finally come knocking. The silence inside the storage room was suffocating. Prince and James stood frozen, their bodies rigid as the glow of the security camera bore into them like an unblinking eye. The weight of realization settled between them. There was no way out. A faint red light flickered on the wall, signaling that someone was watching, recording every second of their downfall. James, ever the schemer, made the first move, yanking at the door handle, his breaths coming fast and uneven. But the lock didn't budge. Panic set in, raw and suffocating, as the truth clawed its way into his chest. Prince, usually composed, was visibly unraveling, his forehead beaded with sweat despite the cold air. They had been careful for so long, evading suspicion, manipulating the system to work in their favor. But now, standing there, the stolen tool still in their hands, they were nothing more than trapped animals, waiting for the inevitable. Footsteps echoed outside, slow and deliberate, and then a voice crackled through the overhead speaker, calm yet laced with finality. "Caught in the act," it said, and Prince's stomach twisted. The trap had not only sprung, it had been waiting for them all along. The door swung open, and the company's security team flooded in, their expressions unreadable, but their movements precise. No words were needed. The evidence spoke for itself. James tried to protest, tried to spin a new lie, but there was no room left for deception. Hands grabbed their arms, firm but restrained, as they were led out of the storage room, past rows of silent workers who had gathered to watch the unfolding spectacle. Prince's face burned with humiliation, his mind scrambling for a way out, but there was none. The same management team that had once been blind to their crimes now looked at them with cold, unrelenting eyes. And then, just as they were being led towards the main office, Prince's gaze landed on a familiar figure standing near the entrance. Emeka. He wasn't gloating, wasn't smirking in satisfaction. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as if seeing through the very soul of the friend who had once betrayed him. It was in that moment that Prince realized the depth of his mistake. He had thought Emeka weak, easy to discard. But now, standing on the other side of the downfall, he understood Emeka had never needed to take revenge. The truth had done it for him. The weight of their crimes bore down on them as they were escorted into the boardroom, where members of the company's highest ranks awaited. The room, once a place where their misdeeds had gone unnoticed, now felt like a courtroom where judgment was about to be passed. The security chief played the footage. Every theft, every moment of deception, every instance of laughter at Emeka's expense. There was no escaping it. The final nail came when the human resources officer, her voice steady, delivered their fate: immediate termination, legal charges pending, and full financial restitution for every stolen item. Prince felt the walls close in, his once comfortable world crumbling beneath the weight of consequences he had never imagined facing. And as the police arrived, their presence sealing his fate, he cast one last glance toward the entrance, where Emeka still stood, his silence louder than any words. For the first time, Prince felt the true weight of betrayal, not the one he had inflicted, but the one he had brought upon himself. The days that followed were a whirlwind of consequences, each one heavier than the last. Prince and James were not only fired, but handed over to the authorities, their names smeared across the company's records as thieves who had exploited trust for personal gain. The weight of their actions, once hidden beneath arrogance, now sat like a stone in their chests as they faced legal proceedings that promised no escape. Their so-called luck had run out, and the full extent of their greed had finally caught up with them. Prince had once believed he was untouchable, that no matter what, he would always find a way out. But now, as he sat in a cold interrogation room, staring at the paperwork detailing every stolen item, every moment captured on camera, he realized there was no talking his way out of this. The same company he had cheated for so long had now turned against him, pursuing charges with a ruthless determination. James, ever the strategist, tried to negotiate, shifting blame, offering information in exchange for leniency, but it was futile. Their downfall had been too public, their crimes too blatant. There was no undoing what had been done. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Emeka's life had taken an unexpected turn. The company, recognizing their mistake, not only reinstated him, but granted him 3 times his previous salary as compensation for the humiliation he had endured. The promotion wasn't just a reward, it was an admission of their failure to protect an innocent employee. Yet, despite the financial reparation, the damage done to his reputation and trust could not be erased so easily. People still whispered, still looked at him with a mix of guilt and pity. But Emeka didn't care about their opinions anymore. He had learned a harsh lesson about loyalty, about the fragility of trust. Prince, the man he had once considered a brother, had betrayed him without hesitation. And now, that same man sat behind bars, not because of revenge, but because greed had led him straight into his own destruction. It was a lesson Emeka would never forget. As he sat in his new office, overseeing the very company that had once cast him out, he felt no joy, no vindication, only the quiet certainty that he had survived. Prince, on the other hand, had nothing left. The courtroom was silent when the judge passed the sentence, the weight of the verdict pressing down on him like an iron cage. 5 years in prison. No appeals. No second chances. He turned his head slightly, hoping, foolishly, to see a familiar face in the audience. But there was no one. James had been sentenced separately, their fates no longer intertwined. His so-called friends, the ones he had laughed with, the ones who had benefited from his stolen wealth, were nowhere to be found. And Emeka? He was gone, moved on to a life where Prince no longer existed. As the officers led him away, chains rattling against the cold floor, he realized the truth he had been avoiding all along. It wasn't just the company that had abandoned him. It wasn't just Emeka who had turned his back. It was the entire world. Because in the end, when greed devoured everything, there was nothing left, not even a shadow of the man he used to be. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.